Did you know that the average tomato plant produces around 10 to 15 pounds of fruit over its entire growing season? But what if I told you that one plant could give you 100 tomatoes in just 30 days? That's right, 100 tomatoes from a single plant in just 1 month. Stick around to see how I did it and learn how you can too. Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today, I'm going to show you how I managed to grow over 100 tomatoes from just one plant in just 30 days. That's right, 100 tomatoes. So, let's dive right in. You might be thinking, how is that even possible? Well, I had the same question when I started my gardening journey. But after a lot of trial and error, I figured out some key tips and tricks that helped me grow a ton of tomatoes in such a short time. If you're ready to see the magic, keep watching. So, how did I even end up with 100 tomatoes from one plant? Well, it wasn't an accident. A few months ago, I was just like any other home gardener, excited to plant some vegetables but unsure of what would work best in my space. I started researching ways to grow tomatoes quickly because, let's face it, who doesn't want a ton of tomatoes without waiting all season? I came across a ton of tips and tricks, but one thing kept popping up. If you want a quick yield, you need to choose the right variety. That's when I discovered Tiny Tim, a compact, cherry tomato plant that could grow in small spaces, but still produce a huge amount of fruit in a short time. It sounded perfect for what I was looking for. At first, I wasn't sure it would really work. 100 tomatoes from one plant in 30 days? That sounded a bit far-fetched. But I decided to give it a shot and, spoiler alert, it worked. But I didn't just sit back and hope for the best. I put in the effort to make sure everything was set up just right. And today, I'll be sharing all the steps with you so you can replicate this success in your own garden. Throughout this journey, I learned some key things that helped boost the growth of my tomatoes, and I'm excited to share those tips with you. So, whether you're a seasoned gardener or just starting out, these steps will help you get the most out of your tomato plant in a short amount of time. This longer intro builds more excitement and context for the story while setting the stage for the rest of the video. It draws the viewer in with a personal touch and a bit of suspense, keeping them engaged with the promise of practical gardening tips that they can follow too. First things first, choosing the right variety of tomato is essential. For this challenge, I chose a fast-growing variety called Tiny Tim. It's a compact, cherry tomato plant that's known for producing fruit quickly and abundantly. I'd recommend going with a determinate variety, which means the plant grows to a certain height and then produces all its fruit in a short time. Perfect for a 30-day experiment like this. Alright, let's kick things off with the most important step in getting 100 tomatoes from just one plant: choosing the right variety. There are so many different types of tomatoes out there, and each one has its own unique characteristics. For this project, I went with a variety called Tiny Tim. You may have heard of it, but if you haven't, let me explain why it was the perfect choice. Tiny Tim is a dwarf variety, which means it stays compact and doesn't take up too much space. This was a huge plus for me since I was growing the plant in a small container rather than in the ground. And although it's a smaller plant, it's still super productive, often producing dozens of small, sweet cherry tomatoes in a short period of time. One of the key things to keep in mind when selecting your tomato variety is the growth habit. There are two main types of tomatoes: determinate and indeterminate. Determinate tomatoes, like Tiny Tim, grow to a certain height, produce fruit, and then stop growing. This makes them perfect for smaller spaces and quicker harvests. On the other hand, indeterminate varieties will keep growing and producing fruit throughout the entire season. They can be great if you have more space, but they do take longer to reach peak harvest. Indeterminate varieties are often larger plants and require more care to manage their growth. Plus, you'll get tomatoes over a longer period of time, rather than all at once. For my 30-day challenge, I knew I needed a plant that would give me a concentrated burst of tomatoes, and Tiny Tim was perfect for that. Another reason I chose this variety is its speed. Tiny Tim can start producing ripe tomatoes in as little as 50 to 60 days, which meant I could get my 100 tomatoes in just a month. Other varieties like Roma or beefsteak can take a bit longer to mature, so I didn't want to risk waiting too long. If you're looking to grow a lot of tomatoes quickly, choosing a fast-maturing variety is key. Another great thing about Tiny Tim is that it's very versatile. You can grow it in containers, hanging baskets, or small raised beds. It doesn't need a lot of room to thrive, which made it perfect for my space. If you're short on space or just want a smaller garden, this variety is a great option. So, my advice when choosing a tomato variety is to think about your space, the time you have to dedicate to growing, and how quickly you want results. If you want a quick, easy harvest in a small space, I'd highly recommend looking into dwarf or determinate varieties like Tiny Tim. But if you have more time and space, feel free to go for the indeterminate types for an ongoing harvest throughout the season. Next up, setting up your plant properly is crucial. I planted my Tiny Tim in a large pot with rich, well-draining soil. Tomatoes need a lot of nutrients to produce fruit, so make sure your soil is packed with compost or organic matter. I also made sure to place it in a spot that gets at least 6 to 8 hours of sunlight a day. That's key for strong, healthy growth. One more tip, be sure to water regularly, but don't overdo it. You want the soil to stay moist, but not soggy. Overwatering can cause root rot and hinder your plant's growth. Now that you've picked your perfect tomato variety, it's time to plant and set everything up. How you set up your tomato plant will play a huge role in how well it grows, especially if you're aiming to get 100 tomatoes in just 30 days. So let's dive into the planting process. First, let's talk about choosing the right container. Tomatoes, especially dwarf varieties like Tiny Tim, thrive in pots or containers because it gives you full control over the soil quality and drainage. I went with a 12-inch pot, which is big enough to let the roots spread out but still compact enough for my limited space. You want a pot with drainage holes at the bottom. This is crucial because tomatoes don't like to sit in waterlogged soil, which can lead to root rot. Now, soil quality is key. I used a good quality potting mix, but I also added compost to make sure the soil had enough nutrients. Tomatoes are heavy feeders, which means they need plenty of nutrients to produce lots of fruit. You can also use a soil mix specifically designed for vegetables or tomatoes, which will often have extra nutrients added in. I recommend mixing in some organic compost or well-rotted manure to help enrich the soil. This will provide a steady supply of nutrients throughout the plant's growth. If you want to go the extra mile, adding some perlite or vermiculite to your mix can improve soil aeration and drainage, which is especially important for tomatoes. Next, let's talk about planting the actual tomato. When you're transplanting your seedling into the pot, make sure to bury it deep enough so that part of the stem is covered by soil. Tomatoes can develop roots along their buried stems, which will help the plant grow stronger and produce more fruit. Just be careful not to plant too deep. You don't want to bury the seedling's leaves. After placing the plant in the soil, I gently packed the soil around the base to secure it in place. Be sure to water the plant well after transplanting, which will help settle the soil and reduce transplant shock. Speaking of watering, don't forget that tomatoes need consistent moisture, but they don't like to be soaked. After planting, water your tomato thoroughly but allow the soil to dry out slightly between waterings. Overwatering or letting the plant sit in water can be a big problem. I usually stick my finger about an inch into the soil to check if it's dry. If it is, it's time to water. One thing I cannot stress enough when setting up your tomato plant is providing support. As your plant grows, its branches will become heavy with fruit, and without support, the stems could snap under the weight. For this, I used a simple stake to keep the plant upright. I carefully tied the plant to the stake with soft garden twine, making sure not to tie it too tightly to avoid damaging the stems. You could also use a tomato cage, which is great for providing support as well. The idea is to keep the plant upright and allow it to grow vertically, which not only helps with air circulation but also makes harvesting easier when the time comes. Now that your tomato plant is securely planted, it's time to find the perfect spot for it. Tomatoes love sunlight, so make sure you place your pot in a location where it will get at least 6 to 8 hours of direct sunlight per day. This is key for strong, healthy growth and maximum fruit production. If you're growing indoors, a sunny windowsill works perfectly. I put my plant in a spot where it gets plenty of sunlight during the day. If you're growing indoors, you might also want to consider using a grow light to supplement sunlight, especially during the colder months. And that's it for planting and setting up your tomato plant. With the right container, soil, and sunlight, your tiny Tim will be on its way to producing tons of tomatoes in no time. As your tomato plant grows, it's important to give it some support. I used a simple stake to keep the plant upright and help prevent the branches from breaking under the weight of the fruit. You can also use a tomato cage if you prefer. This will help the plant focus energy on producing fruit rather than struggling to stay upright. Pruning is also important. I removed any dead or yellow leaves and pinched off some of the side shoots. This lets the plant focus its energy on the main stems, producing more tomatoes rather than excess foliage. Okay, now that your tomato plant is in the ground or a pot, it's time to start encouraging its growth and ensuring it produces as many tomatoes as possible in a short period of time. This step is crucial if you want to reach that 100 tomato goal in just 30 days. One of the first things I did to encourage growth was prune the plant. Now, I know what you might be thinking, pruning? But won't I lose some tomatoes? Actually, pruning helps the plant focus its energy on producing fruit rather than growing excessive leaves or side shoots. For Tiny Tim, I removed any small, non-essential stems or suckers, which are the little shoots that appear in the joint between the main stem and branches. By removing these suckers, I made sure the plant focused all its energy on the main stems, which meant more flowers and fruit. If you're growing larger tomato varieties, pruning can also help prevent diseases by allowing more air circulation around the plant, reducing humidity and the risk of fungal infections. Next, let's talk about feeding your plant. Tomatoes are heavy feeders, and to get those big, juicy tomatoes, you need to give them the right nutrients. I used an organic liquid fertilizer every week to make sure my plant had all the nutrients it needed to thrive. Tomatoes love nitrogen for healthy foliage, but once they start flowering, they need more phosphorus and potassium to encourage fruiting. I used a balanced fertilizer designed for tomatoes, but you can also look for one with a higher ratio of potassium and phosphorus once your plant starts flowering. This helps your tomato plant produce more blossoms, which eventually turn into fruit. I always applied the fertilizer in the evening or early morning to prevent it from burning the plant in direct sunlight. Another thing I did was use a slow-release granular fertilizer that would keep feeding the plant over time. This is a good option if you don't want to fertilize as often, and it ensures that your plant gets a steady supply of nutrients. As your plant starts growing, you'll notice it getting taller and heavier with more flowers and, eventually, fruit. This is where supporting your plant becomes even more important. I made sure to regularly check the stake or cage I set up to make sure it was still secure. As the plant grows, you'll need to tie it gently to the support, making sure it stays upright and doesn't snap under the weight of the fruit. When tying your plant, use a soft material like garden twine or cloth ties. These won't damage the stems, unlike wire, which can cut into the plant as it grows. Be sure to leave some space between the tie and the plant so it can grow without restriction. At this point, it's all about keeping the plant happy. That means checking for pests regularly. Aphids, caterpillars, whiteflies can be a problem. I did a thorough inspection every couple of days to make sure no bugs were munching on my leaves or flowers. If I noticed any pests, I used an organic insecticidal soap to take care of them. It's safe for the plant but deadly to the insects. And remember, when dealing with pests, always spray in the early morning or late evening to avoid harming any pollinators, like bees, which are crucial for tomato plant pollination. As the flowers start turning into small green tomatoes, it's important to make sure your plant stays hydrated but not overwatered. Tomatoes need consistent moisture, especially when they're fruiting, but you don't want to soak the soil too much. I always check the moisture level by sticking my finger into the soil about an inch deep. If it felt dry, I watered, but I made sure not to drown the plant. I watered deeply but allowed the soil to dry slightly between waterings. This helps prevent issues like root rot and ensures that the roots are getting the oxygen they need. With all of these steps in place, pruning, fertilizing, watering, and supporting, the plant really started to take off. Within a couple of weeks, I started seeing tiny green tomatoes forming. That's when I knew I was on track to hit my 100 tomato goal. Now let's talk about feeding your plant. Tomatoes are heavy feeders, so it's important to use a balanced fertilizer. I used an organic liquid fertilizer once a week to boost growth and encourage fruit production. A good trick is to apply it during the evening when the plant is not exposed to the harsh midday sun. This helps prevent any burning from the fertilizer. And don't forget to keep an eye out for pests. Aphids and caterpillars can be a real problem for tomatoes, so I used a mild insecticidal soap to keep them away without harming my plant. Alright, so now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of keeping your tomato healthy and productive, fertilizing and maintaining it. Getting the right nutrients at the right time is key to boosting both growth and fruit production. Let's dive into how I kept my Tiny Tim plant fertilized and in tip-top shape. One of the most important things I did to encourage growth was fertilizing regularly. Tomatoes are heavy feeders, which means they need a lot of nutrients to produce strong stems and lots of fruit. I started with an all-purpose, balanced liquid fertilizer when I first planted the tomato, but as the plant grew and began to flower, I switched to a tomato-specific fertilizer. Tomato fertilizers are specially formulated with the right balance of nutrients that tomatoes need, including higher levels of potassium and phosphorus. These nutrients promote flowering and fruiting, which is exactly what I needed to meet my 100 tomato goal. I usually diluted the fertilizer in water as per the instructions on the label, making sure not to overconcentrate it. Over-fertilizing can cause too much leafy growth at the expense of fruit production. You want a good balance of green growth and fruiting action. When applying the fertilizer, I made sure to pour it around the base of the plant to avoid getting it on the leaves, as that can sometimes cause burns. Besides fertilizing, maintenance is key to a healthy plant. I kept an eye on my Tiny Tim every couple of days, making sure it was getting the right care. One important task is monitoring the plant's health and adjusting for any issues that come up, whether it's pests, diseases, or even environmental factors. I was constantly checking the leaves for any signs of disease, like yellowing or spots, which can indicate nutrient deficiencies or even pests. Yellowing leaves can also be a sign of too much nitrogen, so if I noticed that, I would adjust my fertilizer routine accordingly. Pests can be a real problem for tomatoes, so keeping an eye out for insects is super important. Aphids, whiteflies, and spider mites love to feast on tomato plants. To combat this, I used an organic insecticidal soap every few weeks, which was safe for the plant and the environment but effective at keeping pests at bay. I always made sure to spray the undersides of the leaves as well, since that's where pests like to hide. Timing is important too. I applied the insecticidal soap in the early morning or late evening, when pollinators like bees weren't active, ensuring I didn't harm them while protecting my plant. Watering is another area where consistency matters. Tomatoes like a steady, moderate amount of water, especially when they're fruiting. I made sure the soil was kept moist but never soggy. You can check the soil moisture by sticking your finger about an inch into the soil. If it feels dry, it's time to water. I usually water deeply in the early morning, so the plant had time to dry off before evening, which helps prevent fungal issues. I preferred watering the soil directly rather than spraying the leaves. Wet leaves, especially in the evening, can encourage diseases like blight or mildew, so keeping the foliage dry is important. As the plant matures, it's natural for some leaves to die off or turn yellow. I made sure to regularly remove any dead or damaged leaves. This helps the plant focus its energy on producing fruit rather than maintaining unhealthy foliage. Just be careful not to remove too many leaves. The leaves are the plant's solar panels, capturing sunlight and producing energy for the rest of the plant. Only remove leaves that are obviously damaged, yellowed, or diseased. With regular fertilizing, pest management, and consistent care, my Tiny Tim plant started growing stronger and faster. It wasn't long before I started seeing small green tomatoes forming. At that point, I knew I was on track to hit my 100 tomato goal. Now, after 30 days of care, here comes the fun part: harvesting. My plant was absolutely loaded with ripe tomatoes, and I was able to pick around 100 of them. The key here is patience and regular checking. As soon as the tomatoes turn red, they're ready to be picked. All right, the moment we've all been waiting for: harvesting. After weeks of care, attention, and hard work, it's time to pick the fruit of your labor. But when is the right time to harvest, and how do you do it without damaging the plant? Let's dive in. First things first, timing. The best time to harvest tomatoes is when they're fully ripe. For Tiny Tim, this meant waiting until the little cherry tomatoes were a deep, vibrant red. While you can pick tomatoes a little early, they won't be as sweet and they won't ripen as well off the vine. So, for the best flavor, it's important to let them ripen completely. How do you know when they're ready to pick? Well, ripe tomatoes will have a uniform color, be slightly soft to the touch, and have a rich, sweet smell. The tomato should also easily come off the vine when you give it a gentle tug. If you need to force it, it's not quite ready. When harvesting, it's best to use your hands. Simply grasp the tomato gently and twist it off the stem. You don't want to yank it or pull too hard, as that can damage both the fruit and the plant. If you're harvesting multiple tomatoes, make sure to handle them carefully to avoid bruising. As you can see, I've already started harvesting some of the ripe tomatoes from my plant. I recommend harvesting every few days once the plant starts producing fruit. This keeps the plant focused on producing more tomatoes in and that you're excited to start your own tomato growing adventure. Remember, the key to success is in the details. Choosing the right variety, planting properly, caring for your plant, and harvesting at the right time. Growing over 100 tomatoes in just 30 days was an amazing experience, and I hope this video gave you some helpful tips for your own tomato growing journey. With the right setup, a little patience, and some TLC, you too can get a bumper crop of tomatoes from a single plant. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time with more gardening tips and tricks. Happy gardening, and enjoy those tomatoes. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. And drop a comment below letting me know how your tomato plants are doing or if you have any questions. Thanks for watching,